everyone, and good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our School of Curriculum, Teaching and Inclusive Education public event for this year, which is focusing on global challenges, local classrooms, empowering through science. And I'm super excited for our debate and discussion tonight with our panel members. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we have the privilege of holding this session on tonight. I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and also that this land has always been a place for learning, for education. And I'm looking forward tonight to hopefully continuing some of those traditions of education and learning through the discussions that we're going to be having. I'd also like to pay my respects to Indigenous colleagues joining us tonight and any Indigenous peoples joining us on Zoom as well, and acknowledge the lands of the peoples that are joining on Zoom with us tonight as well. So, welcome to our in-person audience. It's fabulous to have you here in the room, but also welcome to our online guests. We have a number of people joining us online, and we will look to make the session interactive, so questions in the room as we go through, and also there is the opportunity to ask questions online and get involved. You can put comments and questions in the YouTube comments section, and there will be time for questions at the end. So as mentioned, the event tonight's been hosted by the School of Curriculum, Teaching and Inclusive Education. We're in the Faculty of Education at Monash. We're the biggest school. We have 90 academic staff within our school, and a really sort of thriving culture looking at all things education, initial teacher education, teacher professional development, and across different curriculum areas as well. Everything from digital technologies through to HAS and health and PE. But tonight, we're going to be really focusing on some of the brilliant work of our science education research group and the different kind of debates that are happening within the science education community at the moment. So I'm delighted to hand over to our MC for tonight, Professor Sarah Talbot, who is the research leader of our science education research group at Monash. So I'll hand over to Sarah to take us through the panel. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Ruth. Appreciate the welcome. And thank you, everyone, for being here. We are looking forward to a really exciting and robust discussion tonight. My name is Sarah Tolbert. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a professor of science education here at Monash University. I'm coming to you again from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today talking about one of my favorite topics, connecting with students and connecting with global challenges in science education. So we have a fabulous expert panel lined up for you today. They're all experienced science educators who have a long history of linking theory to practice. And here at Monash Education, we believe that our research and scholarship really needs to make sense with teachers and resonate with teachers and students. Most of us are former science educators or former science teachers in early childhood, primary, or secondary settings, and continue to work in the science education space here at the university. But it's a value we all share, is this commitment to working alongside teachers and students and working with. So I'll give the panelists now an opportunity to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Jesse.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, I'm Jesse Chambers. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Deputy Head of Learning Programs for the University of Melbourne's Museums and Collections Department. I have a background in science education and science communication that actually started at Monash. So I did my Bachelor of Education and Bachelor of Science here. And I'm really interested in the overlap between informal or non-formal places of learning like museums and galleries and formal places of learning like schools, and the magic that can happen between those two places, and in particular the kinds of affordances that museums and galleries can offer for global learning. So yeah, that's me.
Good evening, not good afternoon. Sorry, my name is Sophia Tsang. I'm an academic in the Faculty of Science here at Monash and have some background in teaching in addition. Before joining Monash last year, I worked at Te Puao GNS Science, which is the Geological Survey of New Zealand, as the Community and Education Engagement Specialist.
Thank you. My name's Joe Sambono. I'm a Jingly man. My family's from the Northern Territory. I'm currently a professor at QUT, and my job is to incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures across all of the faculties at QUT. But my passion and focus is science, and I'd recently worked with the Faculty of Science there on the reaccreditation of their BSc program. Currently doing a lot of different work. I work with the South Australian Department of Education, but prior to that, I have a history of working as the officer responsible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures at ACARA, and prior to that, I was a manager on hands-on science inquiry learning programs with the CSIRO as well. Before that, I was a high school teacher as well, and before that, a zoologist, and still am. So I'll leave it there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Connie Cerconi, and I am from Canada. I feel like I've been in love with science all my life, and I ended up being a biologist before I transitioned to education, and I worked across multiple sectors, including science museums, government, and now at university. So my role is to prepare future science teachers, and right now I'm working with primary science teachers, and I'm really interested in how embedding First Nations sciences makes science a better discipline. I'm really interested in finding that out.
And thanks everyone for coming, and Sarah for the opportunity to speak. I'm Gil Kidman from obviously the school. I'm a science education researcher, but also into maths and technology. So much of my time is actually spent in the STEM and STEAM world, which I'll be sharing for you this evening. My basic training was in ecology and botany and mathematics. And I just like inspiring people so that they know who they are and what their world is and how they can make their world a better place for everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. All right, really looking forward to this discussion. As you can see, I'm sure you are as well. So we want to talk a little bit about why global challenges. I knew this was going to happen. Yeah. I can keep talking about why global challenges while I get some help with the remote. It could just be user error. This happens to me all the time in class. Okay, thanks. All right, so why global challenges as teacher educators, and again, many of us former early childhood primary and secondary educators, we recognizing the complexity of teaching, we recognizing that teaching has many layers, and teachers have to manage multiple responsibilities, for example, to attend to curriculum guidelines, policy changes, school policy, policy recommendations, and balance assessment imperatives and all of these imperatives with students' interests, experiences, and challenges. So I really want to start now, again, with a round of applause for an appreciation of the hard work of our educators in Victoria and across Australia and beyond. Because again, we do recognize that this is a complex job, and we are very committed to the profession, which is why we do what we do. So back to global challenges as a curricular responsibility, and I want to address these different layers of responsibility that we have to the curriculum, to policy guidelines, and to our students and our communities. So you can see that there are multiple connections here to ACARA, to the Victorian science curriculum, the new PISA guidelines that just came out recently that are looking at PISA 2025, a framework for science or a new vision for science education, really are about preparing young people with the competencies to address global challenges, to attend to these complex socio-ecological challenges of what many are calling the Anthropocene. If you haven't heard that term yet, it's an unofficial term for this particular geological moment in time that we're in that is marked by human impact on the Earth, essentially. So at the same time, we've also been grappling with this question of declining student interest in school science over the past couple of decades, and one might even argue at a moment where we really need our young people to be considering degree programs in science, but also just to see the connections between science, education, and their everyday lives and experience, we're also seeing this steady decline in enrollment and interest in school science and in degree programs. But as Russell Tyler has noted, and this was a couple of decades actually ago, that the school science crisis or this crisis of interest shouldn't necessarily be the primary motivation for change. it should really be societal, social, ecological challenges that determine the way forward for science education, because we really are about educating young people to be citizens of the world, to be citizens of local communities, right? And so what is that society needs, and how do we respond to that as science educators? And those are the questions that we're grappling with tonight. So we're looking at the convergence of curriculum imperatives, student interests, and this polycrisis, if you will, that again many refer to as the Anthropocene. And our hope is that after today, you'll leave feeling both optimistic and inspired by the role that science education can play in addressing these grand challenges. And I'll skip. So I just wanted to end on this idea, though, that it's really about attending to students' multiple dimensions of learning, which is the hands, the heart, and the mind, right? So thinking about the way that we can engage global challenges in creative and innovative ways that are responsive to these dimensions of learning. And with that said, I think Jesse's going to kick us off with a really great example in response to question one. And so question one, we're looking at bridging global and local. How can classroom teachers effectively help students see the connections between global challenges like climate change or biodiversity loss and issues in their own communities? And what are some practical strategies that you've seen work well?
Thank you. I love that question. And I would say that students do see the connections when we give them an opportunity to have a voice at the table and a vote at the table. So my question would be, in response to that, are we inviting students into curriculum planning sessions because they exist in a whole bunch of global spaces, they have connections to the rest of the world, they have a lot to say. And I think at Science Gallery, where I am based at the University of Melbourne, we have a youth advisory panel called Sci-Curious, and they guide the direction of the exhibitions. And so when we ask them all sorts of questions, like the one that you can see on screen right now, what keeps you up at night? They have a lot to say in response to that question. They say that they care about the climate crisis, they care about AI, they care about events that might be happening on the other side of the world that are playing out locally at school. And so by providing opportunities for student voice in the design of learning programs, they're more easily able to see the connections to global learning. And so Science Gallery is part of a global network as well that allows us to connect with other parts of the world. We have galleries in India, we have galleries in Mexico and in the UK, and that allows young people to connect with each other too. I wanted to talk about an example that you can see on screen. We had an exhibition called Dark Matters. And originally, when we went to young people, we asked them, great, we've got this exhibition about particle physics that we want to put on, and we want to call it Dark Matter in partnership with CERN and the Large Hadron Collider. And we proposed that idea to the group of young people, Sci-Curious, and you can imagine what they came back and said, and that it would be not super exciting if it was all about particle physics, but they said, well, why don't you make it more broad? We want to talk about issues that are unseen and unspoken. We see how issues around the world are affecting us. So can we add an S on the end? And so that exhibition became so much more than the origins of the universe and particle physics, but it became about the climate crisis. It became about social injustice. We know young people are early adopters and socially progressive for the most part. And by providing them an opportunity to feed into the design of learning programs, which they do in our museums and collections department, they make the global connections apparent themselves. But you'll always get those students who will say, why does it matter to me? And so in the next slide, I think by providing opportunities for young people to connect with students around the world, and it is totally possible to do so. In the left picture there, you can see a couple of students who were participating in a program that we ran called the Living Room Project, which is a free program from the Victorian Department of Education called the Global Design Challenge, that connects students in other parts of the world, largely the Asia Pacific, with students in Victoria, to solve challenges that are presented to them and bring two parts of the world so closer together. And so I think that quote that you see on screen really sums it up for me, and that is that when you do bring students closer together, that they see how much they have in common And as a result of that, they're able to see that a global issue can be localized in their own context.
Thanks for that, Jesse. I like how you point out that though we might see a decline in interest in school science or science-related degree programs, it's not a crisis of student interest broadly speaking, right? The students actually are very interested in what's going on in the world, and we see that in their activism and the things that they're concerned about in their everyday lives, for example, and it's nice to see those connections. And I'm going to steal that question from my pre-service teachers on the previous slide, what keeps you up at night? So if you're watching, be ready tomorrow. All right, we'll move to Sophia, who's going to talk about connecting the local to the global.
I love how Jesse is talking about the connections between why does it matter to me and these issues, because I think that's one of the questions we get not only at secondary but also at tertiary. We get it quite often. And I think a lot of it has to do with our media, frankly, and also textbooks and things like that. Because of where we are in the world, a lot of our examples don't come from local, but that's actually what a lot of our students really care about. It's what they're familiar with. So we try and use a lot of place-based technologies and place-based pedagogies in our teaching in the Faculty of Science here. So this is an example from my first year class, actually. I teach Earth, climate, and atmospheric sciences over in the Faculty of Science. So we use the Coastal Risk Viewer, which actually allows students to engage in their specific neighborhood about what sea level change might look like. So it's not just in the Pacific, this is an issue. It's okay, in your backyard, this is also an issue. Because it's really easy to get caught up with what's happening halfway around the world, the heat waves in Europe, but a lot of our students aren't ever going to make it there. They're not going to experience that. And so by bringing it back to here, we can talk about the local symptoms and how it's part of this larger problem. So we can actually think about, okay, here's the context of in your neighborhood, here's the science behind it, and here's how it links into the larger context and what we're seeing in the media. So we really are trying to make sure that we have these connections. And one of the ways I've seen this done in secondary is actually when I was working for GNS, we were helping facilitate connections between different international pen pals around certain topics. So, for example, we were talking about earthquakes and we had seismometers in our schools in New Zealand, and we could put seismometers in schools in Switzerland, and actually, because of that connection, they ended up with pen pals from different classes, and they could talk about what they saw locally in each classroom and compare, because the Swiss students didn't see quite as many earthquakes as the New Zealand students did, but they were able to talk about, okay, but this other thing happened in Turkey and it could be similar to us. How would it be different in each place because of our local engineering and things like that? So that way we could actually build geography connections into our physics, into some writing and some literacy that way.
Thanks, Sophia. I appreciate how connecting the local to the global is also about connecting communities to each other, connecting people to each other, and I think that's a big part of what is often missing, right? So thank you for that. So moving to the next question, we're going to look at how First Nation sciences complement canonical sciences and vice versa when teaching about global challenges, and I think this also addresses the local to global nexus. And also, how can non-Indigenous educators respectfully bring First Nations perspectives into their classrooms? So we'll hear from Dr. Connie Zirconi and Professor Joe Sambonio about the educational opportunities presented when we meaningfully represent First Nation sciences in Australian science education. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to say, Joe and I have been talking about this subject for some time, so our response is going to be collaborative. I'd like to start with just sort of thinking about science, and the idea of bringing together knowledge systems is not really new, but last year in Australia, it was a pivotal year because the Australian Research Council introduced the 5 new national research priorities, and one of those was about elevating First Nations, Australian, and Torres Strait Islander knowledges, and that to inform all the other priorities. So I think, you know, the change is really coming here in Australia. And right now, this week in Brisbane, the Australia Academy of Science, Technology and Engineering is hosting an event on sustainable futures, and they have an entire session dedicated to multiple knowledge systems addressing global scientific, climate, and engineering challenges. So it's really exciting time in science, I think. So your question is, well, what does this mean in education? And I'm going to build off your comment about that decreasing student engagement in science, and that often happens, when people think when, students go from high school to university. But, I'm in the primary science ed program, and I'm in a furious agreement with the Office of the Chief Scientist, who says transforming science education actually begins at the primary level. So we think, well, why are students turned off of science? Because it's so cool. We think about, well, probably it's because how we teach science and what we're focusing on, what content we're focusing on. And all the teachers in the room, if your students are asking, why are we learning this, then we're obviously missing something. Jesse, I love your idea of having students informing curriculum at the policy level. And we actually have a lot to learn from First Nations knowledge systems. It's actually quite a nice confluence. Contemporary science, most of us who are training or preparing future teachers, we tell them about the importance of inquiry-based science, teaching in meaningful contexts, teaching beyond just focusing on text and memorizing stuff, but teaching in multimodal ways. Interestingly, all those things are consistent with lots of First Nations ways of teaching and learning. So we have a lot to learn, and there's a lot to learn by bringing these knowledge systems together. And in this slide, we're focusing on why do we do this? Well, engaging all students, but particularly we talk about establishing those foundational attitudes, I guess, dispositions, knowledges from a young age. So this is the norm. And there's so many stories of innovations coming from Australia. For me, it's really exciting to be in Australia because there's thousands of years of innovations that I bring to my science teaching. And then it's also about, as Sarah alluded to before, it benefits all students because they will be global citizens. They will be living in the world, and accessing all these knowledge system only enriches all of our experiences. And for a small subset of students who will go on to study science, well, we know scientific research takes place on the land, in the seas, in our waterways. So we need future scientists to have that cultural acumen, to collaborate with community and to do so in ethical ways. And then an even smaller subset of students, First Nations Australians, who kind of ironically are turned off of science. Like you talk about the strength, the connection to country. Why would these students be turned off? That's a signal for us to we need to do something differently. So imagine, we have more all students engaged, First Nations engaged. Imagine, the contributions we could make to some of those global challenges. And we're going to be highlighting one of the Green Lab challenges a little later on. Joe, do you want to talk about the how? How do we do this?
Yeah, look, that's probably the $1 million question in how do you bring this idea to life in a classroom, I guess. And for me, some of it starts with sort of understanding, I guess, the tradition of the teaching of science in Australia, and probably more broadly, but especially Australia. We're a colonised country where we have for the over 200 years lived under another culture's sort of rule and domination, I guess we could say. But for me, it's about probably starting to recognise that if you thought about when I went to school to study science, virtually any of the knowledge systems that I come from or my family have successfully lived on this continent for 60,000+ years has been devalued or not recognised as valid. So for me, it's about the first step is acknowledging that our knowledge systems are valid and are useful and have lots of, rigorous, data and information that, like I said, has sustained us for so long. Then the second part that I'd like to introduce into schools, and we do try and do this, is to then how do we go about as scientists, as contemporary scientists or future scientists, how do we consult that database? How do we go about, if we can acknowledge that there's valuable knowledge and data in there, how do we go about consulting that? Do we consult people, living people today? Do we consult the technology that has been produced over millennia? Do we consult the long histories of our sustainable ways of living in with habitats and environments, for instance? There's lots of ways we can imagine what consulting might be. But finally, starting to include opportunities for students to learn science and science inquiry skills that require us to start developing cross-cultural acumen and cross-cultural skills. So thinking about teaching science skills beyond that of Bunsen burners, or, you know, understanding that if we do a dissection of a toad, you know, we've got to adhere to care and protection of animals or vertebrates, whatever it is, starting to think about these skills, because this country is changing, you know, where land tenure is shifting rapidly back into the control of First Nations peoples, or the co-management of First Nations peoples. So, you know, a wave of change is happening. Scientists of today and tomorrow are going to have to work with people, with our mobs better, and form these meaningful relationships, and that will ultimately, you know, determine their success as scientists. You know, I better leave it there.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to address the importance of the First Nations context in a science classroom, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary. Joe, do you want to unpack that slide?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that we had this next slide coming. I feel like we're taking up too much time. Yeah, so going back to how some of this might look, you know, if we're going to acknowledge First Nations people's science knowledges, how would we do that? And one of the ways that we have been doing that successfully is using culturally meaningful context to drive the teaching and learning of the science concept, so to speak. I can't see if I can't tell if you guys can see the names on those areas, but you'll see at the centre it's talking about cultural context, and then some examples. But you'll see in the next slide when we get there, it will connect you to the various science disciplines, for instance, be it chemistry, physics, or biology, or whatever that might be. The benefit of doing this, though, is that for the educator, you already have the science knowledge. You understand your discipline knowledge. The only added sort of piece of work is starting to learn some cultural context. So if I was teaching states of matter, for instance, and I was looking at solids, liquids and gases, I might want to use, instead of, when I was taught science, we would be given an ice cube, put on a saucer and told to describe the change. Whereas I can do this through having students look at how our ground oven works, you know, something called a Cup Murray, which is a steam oven which uses, you know, those processes, and it converts the water in the food in the oven into a gas, and ultimately that's the way we cook. So it makes the learning of that particular concept more engaging and more interesting. We talk about science being not as interesting anymore, or learners having interest but, you know, not accessing science. We find that this makes, you know, talk about local context, this gives people of my background some ability to connect with it and leverage off our funds of knowledge, but it also gives all students a chance to learn something about culture whilst learning and sticking to the science curriculum. We're not derailing the science curriculum, we're not adding to the work, we're just suggesting a culturally meaningful context. It's killing two birds with one stone. Like I said, we often teach science using contexts. This model encourages us to introduce cultural context, which then allows you to, all learners, to acknowledge that there are these useful sort of ways of knowing, being and doing already here.
So I think if we go maybe to the slide after that, there are a couple of resources we want to share. I think we think that would be helpful for educators, and I've certainly used in the Bachelor of Education program here at Monash. So if you have your phone handy, I would grab this resource now before they take it offline. But this resource gives that kind of background information. So, you know, the two key questions my students have is, well, how do I find the information about these contexts? And two, how does it connect to the curriculum? So here's your answer, because this resource connects specifically. So this is the K-12 ACARA curriculum, the cross-curricular priority, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, and the science understanding, which is the content or the conceptual focus in science. So it is right there, and that's something I've actually just introduced this week to my second-year cohort. This is background information that it's appropriate to use, and this can enrich, you know, the way we teach science by providing those meaningful contexts. Joe, did you want to speak a bit about that document, considering you wrote it?
I don't know if I can claim I wrote all of it. I certainly led the team that did write it. Yeah, look, I think Connie's already said. It's version 8.4. It's at risk of being deleted. I'm not sure how long the website will be kept, so please go and download a copy of it. I think if you're a science educator, there is a lot of the mystery and a lot of the questions around, well, what could I do and how could I do it is included in there. The teacher background information provides you a lot of the research that's already there. Yeah, I don't want to keep taking. I'm really worried we've got too many slides compared to everyone else.
Should we just? You're okay. You're okay.
We're okay?
Yep.
Okay. But maybe I'll move us to we'll skip the next slide and go to the final slide. How about that? Is that all right, to save a bit of time? Maybe the next one, yeah. So this is a second resource we wanted to share with you. We're quite excited about this. This was a document that we worked on with our project team. We have some members here, maybe some online. We had a First Nations-led advisory team on this. And again, it's a QR code, so grab the resource. But Joe, can you just unpack what that hourglass is and how educators can use this in their science lessons?
Sorry. Yeah, well, it's from the lessons we learnt from school, you know, from the school space of education. The universities are no different. You know, tertiary academics and teaching academics, face the same problems. They're fearful, they're concerned, they don't want to cause offence, they don't know what to do and they need support. So we're always looking for ways to reduce those barriers to ensure that we can start seeing you know, the Australian education system's changing and start to address this. You know, we're probably embarrassingly behind the world in doing some of this work. So we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Australian Council of Deans of Science to produce this framework. In particular, I won't go into the detail of it, but one of the pieces that I've constantly supported educators with, especially non-First Nations educators, is understanding what lane they're in. You know, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and trying to provide a bit of that, in the bowling lanes, the bumpers, you know, to support people in how to do it, but also how deep to go, but an approach or a frame in your mind to think about your role. And to let every educator understand, especially if you're not a First Nations person, that we're not asking you to teach our culture. What we're asking you is to put a spotlight or showcase our culture in your classrooms, be it at universities or schools. So this framework gives some of that structured advice. You'll see the picture there shows two triangles. The important piece to note from this is the top triangle is the support to point out that all of you are able to do some of this without seeking permission from community, without bombarding community. There are lots and lots of things that you as an educator can do independently, respectfully and appropriately, and this document provides you some of that advice. It also tells you when you start going a little bit deeper, instead of showcasing our knowledges or talking more about facts, and you're starting to want to use our knowledges, then it gives you guidance on how you might go about doing that inappropriately, and what's that tipping point. You'll see that line. But is that all right, Connie? Yeah. You're the boss, you know.
And I will say, I literally, like 2 weeks ago, I introduced this document to my fourth year science cohort, and they were just really excited about it because it is, as Joe said, it's empowering. It gives you the permission, and it also ensures that, you know, we don't really have an excuse not to do this. This is saying you go for it, you know, showcase culture, stay in your lane. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe and Connie. And I think in one of the webinars that you've been a part of, you had an example of teachers using this as a professional development tool, going through and looking at a particular topic and thinking about, okay, what aspects would I be able to take on my own or undertake on my own, and what aspects might I need to consult with others, and then who would I be consulting with? And I feel like this is often the question that I find science educators asking the most. I think sometimes there's this mythology that science teachers are resistant to bringing First Nations science knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems into the science education classroom. And I find it's more the case that they're just hesitant, tentative, fearful of getting it wrong or not wanting to do the wrong thing, and maybe to do it with integrity. And so I think that resources like this are incredibly helpful, right? Let's work together and let's think about how this work can be done and how we can support each other in this space. So that's great. I think Sophia is also going to provide us with another example from Aotearoa.
I do have an example, and I'm going to get myself in trouble, but as I guess a professional scientist, I feel I can say one of our big challenges in tertiary is the idea that the scientific method is rigid. And it's really not rigid. And so I think part of the way we can address this multiple ways of knowing and actually bringing in other knowledge systems is by acknowledging that there isn't a linear path in science. There's a lot of observation, a lot of experimentation, and that has been happening for tens of thousands of years here. And therefore, it is absolutely equivalent and parallel and should be respected the same as the canonical sciences that we've been presenting in our classrooms for decades. So I have an example here from Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is the aftermath of a debris flow that was over a decade ago now in Matata, which is on the North Island of Aotearoa. And there were debris flows after a huge rainstorm that took out, as you can see, multiple houses in the area. And there are a lot of questions about how could this happen? How did we not know? And the answer is we did know. We just had to listen to the First Nations who had been there. The Maori had purako, so oral histories about this area, being covered multiple times by debris flows. There's a taniwha in the river, so a monster who lived in the river, and he moves. And as he moves, the river channels move, and therefore we do know that this area has been covered by landslides in the past, by debris flows. We just had to listen. And I think that one of the things we can really do here is actually go when we are actually culturally aware enough about when it's public knowledge and when we know to stop, we can actually go and say, okay, can we learn more about this area? Because you have so much more knowledge and you have so much more depth in the history of this area that actually this is science. It's not just history. It's important that we understand this world around us, and how are we ever going to care for it if we don't know what's happened here in the past? So I would really encourage people to think about teaching the respect for First Nations knowledge, but also that the idea that the scientific method and canonical science is not as rigid, and that's why science changes over the decades. We've seen this with climate change and the climate deniers. Well, this person said this. Yes, 20 years ago, 10% of people thought this, but we've moved on. And the idea that we can actually incorporate more ways of knowing will actually build our strength up in what we're teaching. We just have to be a little bit more flexible in what we're teaching and how.
I like that idea of how teaching from a multiple knowledge systems approach in science education can help build students what we're calling epistemic agency, right? Their ability to draw from many different knowledge traditions and actually make more informed decisions or have a more robust understanding of the world around them and the history and the development of things. So that's a really nice connection there. So we're going to move next to another really important question, and I think this is something that we probably all experience to a degree in our own personal lives, is this: how do we address these big, wicked problems or these global challenges with young people? And we know we probably have heard about eco-anxiety and climate depression. So how do we address problems like this with young people or with children in primary classrooms, with young people in secondary classrooms or even undergraduate tertiary spaces, in ways that are empowering versus disempowering? And so what are some age-appropriate ways to cultivate student agency without making them feel overwhelmed with the enormity of these issues? So Gil is going to share with us a little bit from her work in relation to question 3. Thanks, Gil.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And I was thinking, as I was listening, it's a very fascinating flow of ideas that we've been hearing to get to this point, with the learner or the agent of change at the centre of the diagram, because it's the centre of the discussion as well. Jessie was talking about student voice. It's the person that's happening in these informal science places. Sophia, you were talking about communities and dialogue of the learner. We've got very little referring to the actual content knowledge, the science, in the curriculum. But I like that, because I wrote the inquiry part of the Australian curriculum, and that's been coming up time and time again as something that is absolutely crucial. But I do apologise, Sophia, because when we had to write it, we had to have a linear process, okay? But as the learner gets older, they learn that it does have that loop back and that iteration. So yeah, the inquiry is critical. It's there in the design thinking. Probably design thinking wasn't a big term back in 2009, 2010 when we were writing the inquiry skills. It's much bigger now because of the STEM and the maker spaces, but language changes. But the actual activity within the classroom is there, and it's been there probably going right back to 1916 and John Dewey, way back. It's not a new idea. But when you look at the curriculum and the content, yeah, we're teaching stuff that's been known for 200 years. And I think that's part of our problem. If we stay teaching all our content and make that our focus, which hasn't been the focus here tonight, we're going to continue to lose our students. But if we follow what my research has been showing for my STEAM or STEM team, and I've got a small group in the faculty, we have a book coming out next month. That's the second reference there on the bottom, the et al. But this particular model comes from the work I've been doing with Dr. Hazel Tan in the faculty, and it has the learner at the centre. That's the one that you want to get involved into your learning, into your teaching, so that they are comfortable with the world that they live in and they know how to make a change for tomorrow, rather than just learn everybody's knowledge from 200 years ago. Western knowledge, because that's the content largely of the science curriculum. Into that we have to weave in that wonderful work that Jo has been doing. And I think that's part of our problem as well. We highlight the Western and we expect people to weave it in. What we've also got to be looking at is the STEAM or the STEM. You look around you. You don't see science, you don't see mathematics. We use technology, but it's so interdisciplinary. That's the reality of the world, yet we're not teaching that to students. Yet they know it, and so they don't see the relevance of particle matter unless you let them explore it in relation to black matters, with the plural on the end. So it's how we're presenting and what we're expecting the kids to be able to do. If we have design thinking and we have STEM and STEAM, they will develop part of their own agency. They will develop an interest and they'll think, yeah, I can get involved in that. I can do this. And so, Sarah, if we go to the next slide, I've got a few examples here of how it might look a little bit different according to the age of the student. Having a closer look at some of the language there, we've got local, we've got global. But it's not just about that type of scale. It's about tapping into the ability of the student as well. Just because they're in, say, upper primary and there's local issues that can be learnt there in the problem solving, it doesn't necessarily mean that that child is ready for that. You might have a group in your class that have gone past that. So it's the type of activities that you use in a creative way that is actually going to spark that interest in the student. You can have a totally disengaged student at school, but they like science. And where do they go with that, Jo? Okay? It's about lighting their fires. But you cannot do it just through the content. It's got to be the pedagogy, the content, and the activities, and the reasoning behind it. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Gil. I really like that language of it's about lighting their fires, kind of figuring out how to engage them. Well, for some it's Bunsen burners, but for the majority, I don't know. We'll see. The jury's still out on that one. Sophia is going to share with us an example in practice from our work in Aotearoa about how children moved from understanding to action in their exploration of soil health. And I think this was with primary school age children, right? So even primary school age children can engage with these big complex issues in ways that are meaningful and relevant and engaging. So let's have a look.
So I might have seen Gil's slides before I put this together in one. I can put some faces to this. So one of my roles in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was designing the Soil Safe Kids program. So for a little bit of background, Soil Safe Aotearoa is a citizen science program testing domestic soils for heavy metal contaminants. And as part of that, we were doing some social science research about what do people actually value around soil. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 20% of our population is 15 or below. So while we're doing all the surveying of adults, we're actually missing 20% of our population, the ones who are going into this world. A lot of the community base you're talking about is reminding me a lot of the Soil Safe Kids. So we designed a program where we were going into schools regularly to teach them about soil, but from multiple ways of knowing. So we started with Purako around Hiniahuone, who is the first woman, and she was created out of red clay. And so we could talk about the link with clay and people, and then we could talk about how it's part of our healthy body. And so we're using multiple ways of knowing and multiple disciplinary knowledges to actually build this idea of soil, not just from a Western science perspective, but we could talk about composting and biology, so we could connect to the atmosphere. The picture here is students pulling apart a spade of soil and looking for the worms, because there are multiple types of worms in New Zealand, and actually all of the agricultural worms were introduced species. So they are not spread consistently across the entire country, and so there's actually a citizen science program where they are tracking where worms actually are. So the students here are not only counting the worms to figure out if the soil is healthy, but they're also identifying the different types of worms, so that we can then say, okay, these are indigenous worms, and these are introduced worms. So we have multiple ways of knowing here, but one of the big things we wanted to teach these students is that the end of the scientific method maybe should be a little bit more rigid. Scientists are really bad about doing our experiment, we publish our paper, and then we're done. But actually, that means it's probably behind a paywall. Our next users, our end users, the public doesn't know what we've done. We haven't shared our knowledge with each other. We haven't necessarily shared it with the people who funded it, because a lot of our work is actually funded out of public funds. And actually, we do have a responsibility to do so. And so one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize to these students is, okay, we've gotten to the report stage. This is where we tend to end, even in science classes. But actually, we have one more step here, and it's sharing it with others, sharing our new knowledge with whom else. So we ended up, at the end, for the last sort of half a school day, ended up listening to the students about how they wanted to share their knowledge that they've just gained with the rest of their community and farther afield. So the picture on top there is a whole bunch of paintings illustrating what the students really wanted to tell others, using soil as the pigment for the paints in these images. So we worked with a local artist who used all New Zealand-derived soils to create these paints. The other picture here with the sidewalk or the footpath is a little bit of a sort of chutes and ladders style board game that these kids had created with chalk. And so they spent a whole bunch of time putting facts, and if you got it right, you got to progress up. And if you didn't, you followed the worm back down to somewhere along the way. And so at the end of the day, it was really a lot of fun, because these students had spent a bunch of time drawing on the sidewalk, and then the other classes came out. And the students coming out of the other classes were late to pick up, because they were trying to follow along and learn about the worms and the soil and the chemistry. And so there are ways we can share this science, and actually we can build better scientists when they get to higher up, which is part of what really makes me excited about this. So we can do this at a primary school level. These students were learning at New Zealand Curriculum Level 2. So this is actually really sort of early middle primary school. It's not even upper primary school. And they understood that they had to go talk to others. And this has been really great, because we've actually had a whole bunch of extra schools pick this up. And Hobbiton, which is the movie trailer set for the Hobbit movies, has picked this up actually as one of their educational programs, so that they have students from across the country now actually talking about how actually we have one more step when we write the report. It's to share it with others. And it's not just in this classroom, it has to be farther afield. So I think this is one of the examples that you have on your table on the previous slide.
Actually, that's also a really great example of what Jesse was talking about before, with the partnerships between non-formal centers of learning and formal classrooms, for example. That's a nice outcome of that project. That's fantastic. So we'll move to Jesse next, actually, and we'll talk a little bit about breaking down disciplinary silos. We've talked about the how do we focus and engage content while centering the learner and centering the student and centering some of these big challenges. And we know that traditional science education does often still separate the disciplines into these disciplinary silos, biology, chemistry, physics, for example, amongst others, but that grand challenges are inherently disciplinary. And so how do we address this? How do we support disciplinary literacies and the learning of content and concepts, but at the same time teach in ways that are more transdisciplinary? Over to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll start by describing a science gallery exhibition, which are delightfully odd. They have exhibits in them which, if you look at them at first glance, a discipline may not jump out at you when you first look at them. And I think that presents a unique opportunity for us when we're designing our learning program at Science Gallery. And we really lead with pedagogy, the art and science of learning. It's a great way to describe what we do at Science Gallery. And so design thinking, speculative thinking, and object-based learning are really our bread and butter pedagogies that we use to create programs. But we don't necessarily start with the disciplines that are evident in exhibits. We start with challenges or scenarios or concepts that exist at the boundaries of those disciplines, which might be in the middle of the Venn diagram between two spaces. And so by doing that, we can actually allow students to think about a challenge or a problem, but from the perspective of different disciplines. So when they look at a challenge that might be the climate crisis, or in the case of the image that you have in the top left-hand corner there, that was an inter-school program that we ran with schools in the Merribeck local council area, where they were tasked with solving the issue of equitable distribution of energy. And so that provided a unique opportunity for them to try and solve that challenge, but look at it from the perspective of an economist, or look at it from the perspective of a scientist or an engineer or a technologist. Now, it's not designed to replace discipline-specific knowledge, and indeed those pedagogies, and sometimes I talk to teachers about these pedagogies, and there is sometimes an assumption that they are to be pitted against other pedagogies, perhaps explicit or direct instruction, but all of those can coexist with one another. And indeed, it's really hard to try and solve a problem about climate if you don't already have an understanding of the greenhouse effect. And so we as teachers can give as much or as many pieces of the puzzle to provide that scaffolding for young people when presenting challenges to students. And I reflect back on my first year of teaching, when I thought, great, inquiry-based learning, I'm going to go straight in and run an open inquiry with my year 9 students, and you could imagine how well that went. I think it leads on what Connie was saying about dispositions. I had not created an environment where I had fostered a culture of an inquiry disposition, where I'd provided them with the skills and the tools to ask the right questions, to then figure out, well, what would a scientist look at or consider when they're looking at this exhibit? And so I think by providing opportunities to build those attitudes and dispositions actually equips them well to then find connections across, between and beyond disciplines. And OBL does this, and being in a museum and gallery setting provides so many affordances to be able to do this, and is why I'm so interested in the overlap between formal and non-formal learning settings. And so at Science Gallery, we have a partnership with the Department of Education, where the Department of Education has selected 25 schools that we have deep and ongoing relationships with, that we can track over time and look at how does a museum or gallery actually enrich and enhance the curriculum that's being taught in the school. So it's not a one-off experience. They're not coming for a trip to the gallery and then they don't revisit it when they get back to school, but it is an embedded and deep part of their learning that enhances what they're learning back at school. And I think museums and galleries have a really important role in telling stories, both of the past and the present, but also the future and the preferred future that we want to exist in. And that's what we do at Science Gallery. And because it is so youth-informed, it means that those young people are actively part of that and can see the relevance. And I think, in coming back to your point, Sarah, it's the relevance that allows them to see why it makes sense to them and why it matters to them.
I like this, what you said about the concepts being at the boundaries of disciplines, because I think a lot of the science that is embedded within these global challenges is in and of itself it defies discipline, right? It defies disciplinary categorization. Like we talk about viruses being at the border between chemistry and life, or chemistry and biology, for example. So a lot of these issues in and of themselves are transdisciplinary. And so taking advantage of that and kind of building from that in the way we think about our pedagogies as well is really important. So we're gonna, I think, go to Gil now again. Sorry, is it? I'm just gonna check my notes here. I might have gone. Oh yeah, looking again here at breaking down silos. And I think we're good on time, Gil, so. Yeah,
Okay, all right, thanks. Back to this diagram, but with a different emphasis this time. Hazel and I, when we were putting this diagram together, we called it a plexus model. Plexus as in lots of filaments and networks, because you can't just stick within your one discipline and hope for a happy ending. Everything else has to come in. And the teacher has a really important role in this, because if you're working with worms, we've got the biologist. So the biologist can be looking at all the different types of worms, the worm, how the worm functions. It's basically a hole or a tube, okay? But then we've got the geologists as well with the soil. And if the soil's not right, the chemistry is out, so we've got the chemists involved. But it's absolutely essential that the teacher will be saying, yes, we are in a biology class, but we have to think like the geologist. We have to think like the chemist. And so when a geological concept comes up, the teacher pauses and says, right, geology hats on now. And so the students are developing the ability to think this way. Oh, here's a twist. Let's just move slightly to the side, get that information, bring it back in. But it needs the teacher to be able to teach that way and to help the learners learn that way. The teacher, if they're a biology teacher or a general science teacher in a primary setting, doesn't have all that knowledge. And so this is where co-teaching or co-planning becomes really, really important. And if you were to take co-teaching, co-planning at any stage of that particular model, you will see that it is critical that you've got the input of at least one other person, hopefully with a slightly different expertise that you have. Now, my point at the bottom there, the P5 project in Indonesia, is an excellent example of a revolutionary idea. It's something really great, I think, that came out of COVID. Now, COVID was pretty dark times for most people, but for education in Indonesia, it was a beacon, if you like, because the ministry at the time decided, well, Curriculum 13, which was based on the Australian curriculum, is great. It's content heavy, but we can't do that online. We can't do it in a pandemic. So they switched their thinking away from the curriculum and onto the learner. So what does the learner need? The learner needs to think interdisciplinary. So they invented these P5 projects. P stands for Pancasila, which is all about I am Indonesian and the empowerment of the person. And the idea is you've got 5 different teachers, for example, it could be us, and we've got a primary expert, we've got maths, say, in me, we've got science in Joe. Together we come and we work with a bunch of kids from different ages every week, and we solve a sustainability problem or a religion problem. There could be a political one. And it's interdisciplinary. So it's basically an open inquiry where the school decides, okay, this term we're offering these particular ones, all students will be put in to a group, and then after 6 or 10 weeks, however long it is, they then go to another set of teachers who have co-planned this experience. I don't know why we can't do it. Think of the power. Think of the inquiry skills that the students would get. Think of the interdisciplinary expertise that the teachers would have. So if you're interested in, how can we do an open inquiry? How can we empower students to learn agency? Have a look at the P5. There's lots of documents out there in English. It's not just in Indonesian. And stay tuned, because we have a PhD student in the faculty who will submit later this year, who's done a full evaluation on, I think it's 3 schools, how they've used it in Indonesia and the power that it's given the teachers and the students for taking an action. And if we go to the next slide, very quickly there, it's collaboration is needed between teachers, between people of different expertise, not just the science department or the maths department or whatever. Disciplinary literacies. Know your own discipline, know your own content, but highlight its application and where it comes in from other school subjects and where they see it in the real world. And then there's the scaffolded of different age groups, different expertise as well. So I'll leave it there for you, Sarah.
Thanks, Gil. I think there's a lot of really great ideas there and some inspiration and some questions for us too about how do we advocate, I think, one, for teachers' ability to co-teach or to co-plan or to have the time to collaborate. And I think what is often missed about education and science education research and the work of museums, for example, and non-formal education centers is that we are always enthusiastic to collaborate with educators and address some of these challenges together. I mean, a lot of my work has really been alongside teachers, alongside educators in both non-formal and formal settings. Let's figure this out together because I don't have all the answers all the time. So we work together through participatory action research, for example, to develop and what comes out of it, these beautiful frameworks like Gil has shown you in collaboration with others, with Indonesian teachers, for example, models that others can follow. So I think if this is something you're interested in, whether you're online or here face-to-face, as, for example, as an educator who is interested in a partnership or as a potential PhD student, think about, you know, what you might propose, and we're always happy to hear from you and collaborate on these kinds of problems together. And I think that's really important to highlight because a lot of the work that we're sharing does really come from these on-the-ground collaborations. With that said, I think also Sophia was going to talk a little bit about systems thinking. We talked about how this science is inherently disciplinary, but the world is inherently like about systems thinking, isn't it? So you want to share? We'll swing back to that a little bit.
So I think we should swing back to that, but I also want to point out that I think there's another type of collaboration that maybe hasn't been discussed as much. Professional scientists have a lot of data, and it's hidden away in databases, and it might need proprietary software, and there are things we can do as scientists to adapt it, to make it small enough that it's manageable for you and your students, and I think there's something really lively around real data, local data that students enjoy. So the other collaboration I'd suggest is reaching out to scientists who might be willing to adapt some of what they have for you, whether that be physical things on loan. Monash has the largest fossil collection in Australia, through to data sources and things like that. So I guess I can turn this into a plug if you want earth science data.
Yeah, I already did, so.
So the thing that I want to mention here is that actually a lot of the earth scientists here teach earth science as earth system science. So we talk about in the very beginning of the year that the earth is a system, it's a series of interlinked spheres. So we have a geosphere, including all of sort of the geology, we have the atmosphere, and how all of these spheres are exchanging energy between them and maybe matter between them. The hydrosphere and the cryosphere are going to be exchanging matter between them. And that actually this provides a way of linking our challenges into different disciplines and by using this sort of earth frame. So for example, when I was teaching physics, we had slinky seismometers and we could teach Hooke's law, which is very much a content-driven lesson through this idea of the earth, and then we could link it into the geography in terms of, okay, there was an earthquake in Japan last week, and here's some video footage that we found on YouTube, and we can link it into things beyond just science, actually. And so this is really linking everything to the anthrosphere, but at the same time, the anthrosphere is what we live in and what we operate in, and so it is how we bring it back to the student in terms of how is this relevant for you? People go, I don't have to worry about earthquakes. Well, there actually is a fault less than a kilometer from where we're sitting right now. So there's the potential that there will be an earthquake here in the future. Even in Australia and Victoria, there's a fault that runs right by the Peninsula campus. It's actually quite large and could make an earthquake as large as what we saw in Christchurch in 2010, but in Frankston, which is pretty darn close, frankly, for the size of that earthquake. So there are many ways of doing this, and one of the great things actually is things like Slinky seismometers, our citizen science projects. Even here in Australia, there is a seismometers in schools program. It's sort of quieted down a little bit since the expert in charge moved to New Zealand, but it does still exist, and it is absolutely a way of being able to link multiple things together. So I really would encourage teachers to think about how can you actually leverage some of the professional science through citizen science, and also by asking us stuff about your own neighborhood. Community-engaged science and community-led science is really important, and I think it's a really great way of involving students in inquiry-based and getting them to see the larger impact in their neighborhood, but also farther afield.
Thanks, Sophia. We're going to come back to Joe and Connie's earlier contributions now as well, and looking at how multiple ways of knowing helps us rethink disciplinary boundaries in science education as well.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I think we'll skip this slide because we've touched on some of those things just for the sake of time. So we'll launch right into the, innovations in science. So something that, we're very much aware of. Times are changing in contemporary science. Instead of studying, making, First Nations people participate in science are actually co-designers. So they have voice and agency in the conduct of the research, what is research, and that it should benefit all. So that's kind of an overarching thing. And I keep bringing us back to science, but science, as Sophia was mentioning, changes very quickly. And sometimes it takes a while to distill those practices and understandings in the science education classroom. And when Joe and I were talking about this, we each sort of thought about, oh gosh, of course First Nations knowledge systems will break down those silos because that's sort of inherent in the First Nations, ways of knowing. And then we each thought of quotes that, kind of reminded us of this practice. And I'll touch on the first one, the late Richard Feynman, who's an American physicist. So this is something that he was recorded to say in 1964, if you want to just read that out loud. But basically, I love this quote because I say to my students in the Bachelor of Ed when I'm introducing this Australian science curriculum, which is conveniently broken down into biology, chemistry, physics, and earth and space science, I'm like, nature doesn't care. So it's just a reminder, it's like nature's doing its nature thing, we humans are just doing our best to make sense of the world, but sometimes that can be limiting. And Joe, you brought up that Boyer lecture as well.
Yeah, no, again, I think we're talking about breaking down silos. I always think First Nations peoples of the world are holistic cultures. We don't like silos. We do prefer our cross-disciplinary approaches, if we think of that. If you think of someone similar to what Gil was saying before, but if you think of a person napping a stone, you're dealing with a whole heap of different science knowledges that weren't necessarily split up. You might be considering the wound ballistics of the tip you're making for a spear regarding the biology of the target species, or you might be considering the geology or the mineral that you are using to actually source to make the particular blade, or you might be using applied understandings of Hertzian cone fractures from a physics point of view. So you've got all of these things together. But the other part that I think talks to a lot of the ways that First Nations peoples have long understood around knowledge is how mixing diverse perspectives together often results in new knowledge, new understandings. And one of the earlier slides we were going to discuss, I'll touch on because I think it's worthwhile, is you've all heard the word Gama. You've all heard of the Gama festival in Arnhem Land, Yolngu people. That word describes a natural phenomena in the environment where fresh water and salt water come together and mix, and when the water comes together, it spirals around and mixes. And during that mixing, as foam is produced, and it's a good metaphor for knowledge systems coming together, and it's what it was originally used to describe in that way. And it was often looking at, in an education context, having the two systems, the Yolngu system and the education system come together and to teach and value each other, not belittle or exclude each other, both come together for the betterment. But that works in science as well, and it's a good metaphor. And I think one of the things that Australians, it goes back to some of the ideas about what we want to try and ensure happens in classrooms, is getting people to acknowledge that we actually have valid repositories of knowledge, right? So if you fast forward into the profession or practicing scientists and you get into universities, then how do I make sure that the future scientists actually understand this and they might want to engage with our knowledges? That might lead to foam, might lead to new innovation and so on. And some of, on the slide, we talk about some of the problems that are emerging in the Anthropocene, things around, drug resistance against these hospital sort of based staph infections that we hear about. You'll see that some of the innovations there, people are looking at plant material that's being used to smoke, has long been used to smoke surgical instruments traditionally, and then using that same sort of material to treat hip implants. In things. I mean, this is really happening. This is genuine sort of new approaches, and these particular native plants are some of the only things that are known to be, to fight against those particular staph strains. We've got issues around plastic waste as a global issue. Material scientists are starting to get out of their silos and starting to see that perhaps the biopolymers and plastics that have been long developed by First Nations Australians can be investigated for their components. And it's not just about extraction of knowledge and taking the knowledge and using it. It's also about collaborating with respective people. So the case of the polymers is an agreement that's occurred recently with the University of Queensland and the respective traditional owners from near Mount Isa. But these are likely to lead to some really impressive, solutions in that. You see use of fish poisons, and you're well aware of land management practices. You will be hearing more and more about, traditional fire, the reinstatement of traditional fire regimes. Some of that use of technologies, like you're talking about, using NASA satellites to monitor carbon or greenhouse gas equivalent emissions. Communities then are coming together to reinstate traditional fire regimes to reduce the amount of pollution which they can draw an income from dirty providers like gas industries and liquefied gas industries and so on. I'll shut up there. I'll leave it there. But yeah, there's lots of exciting ways if we are to shift in the ways we've been working.
So in the next slide, we wanted to highlight an example, I guess, that is close to us. So Katrina Ruck is, she was one of the advisors on our advisory committee for that ACDS curriculum framework that we made. And literally the month that we launched the framework, she won the Young Australian the Queensland Young Australian of the Year Award for her innovation. So this is a scientist who is drawing on multiple disciplines to solve the problem of forever chemicals in our water. And I won't even pretend to explain how she did it because she's a scientist. But the point is, she drew on the knowledges of multiple disciplines to solve this. So it's that interdisciplinary approach is real. It happens in science and it's necessary. And we mentioned earlier in an earlier slide that, the green lab, this is her Nuki Kula green lab. So she's made a business of it, but not just she's generating a profit, but that profit is actually going back to First Nations communities who have been adversely affected by, this pollution. So it really brings in full circle the idea of why we want to engage students in science, and particularly, we start nurturing, a new generations of First Nation scientists, and then they can solve these problems, connect with community, and really it's a game changer for how we can do science and showcase examples in our schools. This is why we're learning this in chemistry. It's why are we learning this? Well, forever chemicals, it actually impacts all of us. And I'm gonna, we won't have time to watch the YouTube, but if you wanna hear, she just does an amazing job talking about how she connects with communities and visits local communities that have never seen a scientist, much less a First Nations Australian science. So she's inspiring young people as we speak, which I think is pretty cool. So the next slide, the final slide, we'll talk about, we'll go to the next one actually. We're gonna highlight some features in the Australian curriculum. So I know sometimes people are challenged by sort of the structure of the curriculum and the siloed nature of the Australian curriculum, which I alluded to. If you look under science, understanding, you'll see those 4 disciplines, but there's actually lots of opportunities to break those silos. And Joe, do you want to talk about that 3D curriculum and maybe the cross-curricular priorities?
No, I think I'll just add that that probably, the desire for my people to be included in education, be it schools to universities, is a long-standing sort of challenge that we've had and we've lobbied a long time for. And it's probably out of having the Australian curriculum, supposedly a national curriculum, that we get that formal way of including it happening, seeing it happening national, an agreed approach. I think for too long it's people are doing different things all over the place. I think the 3-dimensional curriculum gives you a model in which you can try and incorporate this across all of the phases of learning, across all the years and across all the learning areas, but in particular science. And I think it's a better model. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's a better model than putting us back into a silo of a learning area ourselves. I think people talk about not having enough teaching time to cover all of the learning areas as it is. For us to go away from a model like this and propose that we teach this agenda as a standalone subject, I think won't work. So I will always, I don't necessarily agree with ACARA. I've worked for them. I don't always agree with them, but I do think the 3-dimensional model is one that has value, especially when it comes to this agenda. And I'd point out to you that there is a lot of stuff as it relates to science already in version 9 of the Australian curriculum. The website is a nightmare, but if you can navigate through that, you will find useful information, Yep.
Yeah. I think that's it.
Oops. All right, thank you. I really like this point about the creation of new knowledge, and again, that connects to another curriculum or international curriculum policy point about transformative competencies coming out of the OECD, right? The ability to generate new knowledge or to innovate, for example, to think critically, to think outside the box. So this idea of innovation as a competency that we need to be thinking about with young people. That also requires a degree of epistemic humility, as Joe was pointing out, that the sort of the importance of a responsible collaboration, meaning you don't come to it thinking you have all the right answers, that you might come to it from a particular knowledge tradition or disciplinary perspective, but that you're open to listening, as Connie was talking about. And that's, I think, where the place that new knowledge can be built. So I know we want to have some time for questions. So I just want to give Gil, can you in 1 minute, let's leave with a note of hope, because you have some really great points, I think, about for educators who are thinking about starting on this journey or wondering how maybe it feels overwhelming and it feels like a lot. Can you just give us a point or two about how they might begin in small ways?
It will take time. That's short enough?
Thank you, but that's beautiful. I love it.
This particular slide is showing multiple journeys over time. Okay, you start small, you get bigger. If you look at it from what happens in the classroom, the teacher can start with, in the first 6 months, teach the students how to work and think interdisciplinary. Like Jessie said, you can't walk in and do an open inquiry. Okay? We could look at this model if you're doing professional development, which is where this one's grown out of the work that we're doing in Southeast Asia. It takes time. The people that you're working with, the ministry, the collaborators, they need to understand what you do today, tonight, will take time to have an impact into the classroom. And from our work, we're seeing a 2 to 3 year turnaround. What we do, providing the teachers keep working at it, it's exponential. In 2 to 3 years, we need something more now. But it will take time. So I'll leave it there. I think it was a bit
I
over
think
1
that's
minute.
great. That's great
Sorry.
advice. Thank you. It will take time. So yeah, that's really important. All right. So thank you so much. I just want to say thanks to all of our panelists. I know I've learned a lot from all that you've shared, and I feel really inspired. I hope you all also have some mental notes, some key takeaways that you're going to take from this discussion. And we'll now turn it over to you. So there's a slido.com link, and I think I'm supposed to go to that slide next. And you can add questions to that slido.com poll, or if you're in the room and you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, you can ask a question to specific panelists, or you can ask a more general question to anyone. Then it's over to you now. We'd love to hear from you. Questions, thoughts, comments. We'll give you a few minutes in case you'd like to pose a question in the Slido. Do we have a hand? Yes. Great. Let's see. Yeah.
I have a general question, but it builds on what Jesse and Professor Gilman were talking about. Do you believe that the disengagement we're seeing in school-taught science and formal education scenarios is more because these formal education, traditional forms of learning are relatively more static and less relevant to what the students, what the learners see in real life?
Yeah, I'm happy to start that one. I think young people are engaging with content in a range of different ways now, and school classrooms need to acknowledge that they are engaging in those different ways, digitally, but also in different spaces too. And it reminds me of the concept of third spaces, which museums and galleries are. So the first space being the home, and second spaces being school, the school or the workplace, but third spaces being those community spaces which learning does happen in. Learning doesn't necessarily just happen in the four walls of a classroom. It can happen anywhere, and I think young people know that. And I think that there is room for the curriculum and for teaching and pedagogy to grow with that too.
And I think social media, or even just, having a device has opened up the world to school students in ways that it hadn't before. So here we have a textbook, and it's printed, it's there forever, it's yours this year, mine next year, whereas that's not what they're seeing. And so they get all this information, they're sorting it out, and it's a lot more exciting than what we're doing in our restricted classrooms as well. So I think that has a big thing to do with it.
Thank you. I think we'll go to a question online. Let's see, we've got equal number of votes for the three questions, so I'll just start with the one that's at the top. What sorts of policies, infrastructure, or support could better facilitate youth agency or youth voice, particularly in determining priorities and directions for their school science experiences? And could you share any examples? It's open.
I'll have a quick go. I think we need school leadership teams to facilitate a dynamic way of teaching and learning as a point of difference to what we're mandated to do. We're mandated to have our disciplines, but we need leadership to buy in and to empower teachers and students to try something different. I think that will also require the principals associations to be involved, maybe, the education department as well, and to be able to create time to get kids safely to and from museums or bring museums in. It's so much harder to do excursions now, it's ridiculous. But I think we need to bring that back.
Yeah, I would agree, but I'm totally biased. So, but to the point, about what are the things that we can do to facilitate youth engagement and youth voice. In terms of recruiting voices from the student cohort, quite often I see examples of student representative councils that are made up of students that will say the thing that the teacher wants to hear. Whereas when we go out and ask for student voices, we want the kid at the back of the room who's disengaged and who doesn't want to participate in that science lesson. And so I think about selecting, or not just selecting, but inviting young people to be at that table. And I think the Student Representative Council in Victoria does this really well, because they're young people that are part of that, actually are part of their governance structure as well. So they have voting rights, they have decision-making capacity, and it's very, very much a shared responsibility that I think schools can look to when it comes to making decisions about curriculum.
I'll just share briefly, because I think there's a connection between the last question and this one as well. In terms of students' interest in learning, first and foremost, I think I love this quote, and I've shared it with our science education research group, and I've shared it with students. It's this quote from a colleague, Jeff Duncan Andrade in California, but he says, "I've never seen a kid who's not motivated to learn, but I have seen a lot of kids who aren't motivated to do school," right? So learning is an inherent human quality. We are interested in the world around us. We have big questions about ourselves, our communities, et cetera. But in my own work, I've worked a lot with young people who have been disempowered, who've been socialized to do school in a particular way. And when I first started out as a university lecturer, very wide-eyed and ready to go in and change the world through science education, and would talk to the kids about, what they wanted to learn, how they wanted to learn, what might be empowering. I got a lot of blank stares, but I was working with young people who had been socialized to think about school in a particular way and kind of lost the spark or lost that connection to seeing school as a place where they could actually find something of interest. And so there was a desocialization process that had to happen, and a trust building process that had to happen before, and a getting to know them on their terms process that had to happen before we could actually do that work together and then really start asking these big questions together. So I think that's a really important point. And the other point there that I just wanted to add is policy work, principals association, teachers unions. I think there can be a lot of momentum within teacher collectives, building momentum in those spaces that already exist. But then finding the pockets of resistance, like two people getting together and say, hey, we're going to try something. We're going to go against the grain, right? That, I think, is the most powerful example of grassroots change that I've seen that can really take effect. And then other people go, hey, what's going on? Or the students start to talk about what's going on in so-and-so's classroom, right? And other teachers hear about it and come to find out what's happening. So those kinds of things are really important. Do we have time for one more question from the room? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for that wonderful panel. As a scientist sitting in your midst who works on a grand challenge of antimicrobial resistance, I'm wondering from your perspective, what would be helpful to have from our scientists to be able to make those grand challenges more accessible, relevant, local? What can I take back to my community to help enhance yours?
I'll start us off because in topic 3, we talked about biological science and living and non-living things. And I have these little stuffed toys. One is a cold virus and one is a, I'm forgetting, two different stuffed toys that represent viruses because we don't often see them. And they don't need to know this in primary science education, but I believe my students need to know the difference and why it matters. And I think it would be really powerful to have someone come in or resources come in to my classroom here at Monash University to explain some of the research that you're doing. Because I can tell them, from what I read, there's not a lot of money going into antibiotic resistance, and that's a huge problem because, it could be that we die from a cut. And, they kind of have these blank stares, and it's not really in the press much, but it's actually a big concern. And how can I translate that to my students in a way that they can bring that to their, to their future students in a way that's meaningful, not scary, but it's like, maybe I don't need to buy that antimicrobial soap, or maybe I can just use regular soap and water. Like that's a real life challenge that they have to sort out. So I'd love to make those connections myself, just, in my own primary science classrooms. That's just my response. Does anyone else want to respond to that?
I would just say it would be great if at a tertiary level science outreach was more prioritised for academics, because it is so powerful, as Connie's just pointed out. And obviously in you asking the question, you can see that there's relevance in reaching a primary audience, because that's where hearts, minds, hands will be changed. So a comment more than anything.
Have you, I'm not sure if CSIRO are still doing it, but they used to have a program called Scientists and Mathematicians in Schools. You could see if that's still going and register with that. If it's, it should still be going, yeah.
Great, thanks everyone. Yes, more collaborations with scientists, please. We love it. All right, so I think we're gonna move to close. And first, we just wanna thank our panelists for their contributions and all the inspiration and great ideas. Thank you so much, each of you. Thanks to Ruth and Karen for organizing, and Chandra for your brilliance, and our tech team over here behind the scenes, keeping everything flowing smoothly and online. So thanks everyone for all your support. We really appreciate you, and for all of you for showing up tonight and being here and listening, and your great questions. We appreciate you. A couple of upcoming events. There's a Master of Teaching webinar that will be of interest, an algorithmic awareness session as well, helping young people navigate the digital world, which I just signed up for today because I have 2 teenagers. So please check out these events. There's a QR code, just grab that with your phone, and we hope to see you at these future events. And thank you again so much for everything. Thanks for being here, and have a wonderful night.